A lifetime since we were introduced to a vice presidential candidate who, in many ways, marked a new era of U.S. politics, Sarah Palin. And now a lawsuit she's filing could mark a new era of media norms. At issue is a 2017 New York Times editorial which decried the state of American politics. It was written after 4 people, including House Whip Steve Scalise, were wounded in a shooting during a congressional baseball practice, but it also referenced the 2011 shooting of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and claimed, quote, the link to political incitement was clear from that shooting to Palin's Political Action Committee, which had released a graphic of districts that Republicans were aiming to flip, marked with crosshairs, including Giffords' district. The Times issued a correction the following day, saying the editorial had incorrectly stated that a link existed between political rhetoric and the 2011 shooting, but Palin still filed suit, claiming the piece had defamed her. Jury selection in her trial was supposed to start today, but was delayed 10 days because Palin has tested positive for COVID. According to a landmark Supreme Court case, New York Times v. Sullivan, Palin needs to show actual malice to prevail. She says she will do just that. Joined now by Washington Post media reporter Sarah Ellison. Sarah, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the trial, I was reading your Twitter account, and when the judge announced that the trial would be delayed 10 days, you quote him as saying, because she tested positive for COVID, she is, of course, unvaccinated. Was he saying that with sarcasm, or what was the tone of his voice when he said that? She is, of course, unvaccinated.
He was saying that straight. And I realized that it comes off on Twitter as a big eye roll and with some snark. And I wondered myself what that, of course, was for. And my guess, and again, I have not clarified this, and so that's always a dangerous game for reporters to speculate in that way. But I will preface it by just saying that this is most likely a conversation that he had the night before when he learned that she had tested positive, and that was something that he was sort of referring to, that the lawyers had brought up, and so he was not sort of announcing it in a way that like he was presenting new information, but he was saying, of course, she's unvaccinated. We've covered this before. That's one interpretation.
That is
or
one.
He was being incredibly dry and I didn't catch his sarcasm.
Got it. Okay. So the New York Times will contend it was an innocent mistake. They made a mistake. It was an innocent mistake which they corrected. Sarah Palin will claim actual malice, the New York Times versus Sullivan Standard. Other than the fact that I assume she will contend this is just yet another liberal rag out to get me, what else does she have, from what you know, to demonstrate to a jury that there was actual malice?
Well, what her lawyers have sought to get their hands on and have gotten are a lot of internal communications at the New York Times. So James Bennett is the former editorial page editor who inserted these errors into a story on Deadline. And one of the things that that Palin's lawyers are trying to show is that James Bennett ignored hyperlinks in the original story. He ignored the Times' own coverage. How could he not have seen those things that were in the very stories that he was looking at? And there is some, it's unfortunately for the Times, it is a pretty stunning thing to have not seen those links in the stories. Again, they are arguing that he was looking at, he talks about having one eye on the clock, Deadline approaching. He was trying to punch up the editorial, but it all, interestingly, and as you mentioned, this is a jury trial. It will all go down to the credibility of the witnesses and what the jury is convinced of.
And just to be clear, there was an editorial writer, but Bennett himself added the phrase in question that's the subject of the litigation. Am I not right about that?
Correct. We only learned this after the fact because editorials in the New York Times, as in many papers, are unsigned. Sure. And so it was only through discovery that we learned that the original editorial writer, Elizabeth Williamson, had handed in her story, and then James Bennett read it and decided to jump in and sort of punch it up. And it turned into what it is today, which is a no one argues that this was a fortunate situation for the Times.
So either way, regardless of who wins this thing on the trial level, it's going to be appealed, I think, quite obviously. It ultimately makes its way to the Supreme Court. what I've read from a number of places, including in your paper, that Gorsuch and Thomas, Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, two justices obviously, have been, I don't know if licking their chops is too strong a set of words, but appear to have been looking for an opportunity to revisit the standard New York Times versus Sullivan and possibly relax it some. Is that your sense of the world as well?
Well, yes, licking their chops would not be my choice of
I figured
phrase,
it would,
but
yes.
but we do see that Thomas first had indicated that the media environment has changed so much that Sullivan, the Sullivan standard, which was established in 1964 in a case versus the New York Times at the time, is no longer meeting the moment. And Gorsuch himself then later said that it sort of seems to be a guarantee, an insurance policy for falsehood, that you can put something forward and not face any repercussions. So yes, the idea of the stakes in this trial couldn't be higher for press freedom advocates.
I want to get back to the stakes in a minute, but it seems to me, and this is not an original thought, I've read it in a number of accounts of this trial, is that while the New York Times is nervous about having its dirty laundry aired, about how they, get to editorial in paper, the right-wing media, Fox News as an example, and they're reporting, for example, on the Dominion voting systems where they say Dominion rigged the election to make sure that Trump would lose. It would seem to me that those media outlets have much more to fear than places like the New York Times or the Washington Post, reputable media outlets, no?
Again, what we're facing and looking at the Times, I mean, it's very difficult to say what people really have to lose. Normally you say, yes, the Times was careful, it is careful. In this instance, certain people think that, however, in this moment of incredible partisan vitriol, some people think that the New York Times is just a liberal rag, no better than, what someone on the left would say is what Newsmax or OAN or some other kind of less reputable outlet might bring to a case like this. And I think that my reporting indicates that the question of the jury is really one where it makes it very difficult to prognosticate. I hear your point, and if it were just before judges and lawyers, I think that question would be more easily answered. But we are, I've talked to some legal scholars and legal experts who say that the jury will not be able to ignore the atmosphere in which they exist.
Well, since you just said it's very hard to prognosticate, let me ask you to prognosticate one more time before you leave. Assuming Sarah Palin wins this thing at the ultimate level, at the Supreme Court, how does that change how responsible media outlets cover elected officials? Does it?
The Sullivan standard really was set up to encourage aggressive reporting of public officials, particularly, but all sort of public figures. Again, it will depend on the kind of language that any kind of decision that would come down on it. But I think that there's no question that it would cause more restraint in reporting if Sullivan were somehow tightened up in some way. When reporters are looking at taking on a high-profile public figure that they wanted to write about or investigate, there's no question that Sullivan provides a level of comfort when you're trying to do that type of in-depth and investigative reporting, that as long as you are being honest and making your best effort, most reporters in the United States, where we have the freest press in the country, feel a level of protection that they would not feel if Sullivan were changed.
Sarah Ellison, you'll be glad to hear the prognostication portion of this interview is over. Thank you so much for your time. Your work's terrific. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you again.
Thanks.